Welcome back to Regenerate, or some of you may be coming back. Some of you may be watching this for the first time. Welcome if you haven't seen our show before, and welcome back if you're a repeat viewer. Those who have been watching the show for a while know that we've spent our time moving around the world, investigating different kinds of regenerative farms. We were in Kenya with Dalmas Tiampati and his regenerative pastoral farm. We were with Isabella Tree in southern England with her rewilding project, Mimi Castile in Oregon, and her experiment with regenerative agriculture and winemaking. And the all too famous Joel Salatin, that crazy guy who's one of the great champions of regenerative farming on the East Coast. After watching us actually for such a long time, some of you may be thinking to yourself, I kind of fancy having a regenerative farm of my own. We've had a number of people say, well, what would that actually involve? It's kind of a repeat, I guess, of The Biggest Little Farm. Some of you will have seen that movie about a couple of wealthy people who found themselves founding an organic farm. And actually, my guest on the show today was involved in the early days of consulting on that movie itself. Andrew Beedy is... Andrew, how would I describe you? You're a consultant, a maven, an expert on regenerative organic farming. Is that one way of putting it?
Well, I think that's one way of putting it, but I think to go back to the beginning, just a farmer at heart who started a business and design and build out of biodynamic farms about 5-6 years ago, and still just spend my days playing in the mud and shepherding farms in the right direction.
Well, it's the playing in the mud that we love at Regenerate, Andrew. On your website, you talk about being, and I'm flashing it up now, an organic and biodynamic expert. What's the difference between biodynamic and organic farming, and how does the concept of regeneration play in those two spheres?
Well, certainly this is definitely the main question that we always get is, what is the difference between organic and biodynamic? And I would say simply that in a biodynamic setting, we don't just sort of switch out synthetic inputs or farm inputs with organic inputs like an organic farm. We actually try and build the fertility within the farm system from within the farm itself. So not just replacing a synthetic organophosphate input in a conventional farm with a organic material. We actually want to go further beyond that by layering on different farming techniques onto that base model.
So, Andrew, how do you get into this game? You say it's in your blood. You must have dirty blood, in the sense that, have you got soil in your blood?
Well, I was born on a biodynamic dairy farm in I don't want to give away too many details, but 1980, so just turned 40 and slightly less hair now. But born onto a biodynamic dairy farm where my dad was the dairyman there. So when one is born into quite literally onto a biodynamic dairy, one doesn't really have much choice in the direction of where your career is going to go. So after 40 years of playing not just in the mud, but in dairy barns and orchards and every other farming model you can think of, then that's quite literally in my blood.
Well, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, Andrew, that there are people who grew up on farms who, at the first opportunity, fled to the city and never went back? It's a very tough way to make your living. It's hard work. No one ever really got seriously rich through farming, at least in the last 100 years. So it takes more than just being brought up on the farm to become a champion, a pioneer like you of regenerative farming.
Well, I think you have to start. I mean, in a biodynamic setting or in an organic setting, you have to start with a solid foundation, right? In any kind of farm development. and that solid foundation is, the fertility system within that farming ecosystem. And then the foundation that I have in my business and in my career is that it's all built on a solid foundation of just practical knowledge and how to build and manage and develop a farming system. So it has to be, every man and their dog wants to be a farm consultant, but it's you can only really do that if you have a solid practical experience already in your background. So,
Right, and that is indeed why we're having you on the Regenerate show, because you're not just a dreamer, you're not just a romantic, you're in the business of making these dreams a reality. That's your business. You have an integrated system for biodynamic farming. So if someone was to come to you and said, I want to farm, you have a system, you have that foundation. Is that fair?
Well, certainly. And it's not just the foundation and the system in a organic sense, but it's bringing a lot of 21st century tools in sort of assessing a farm system with its potential of being a biodynamic farm. And I mean by, we use electromagnetic scans of soils, we use computer modeling, there's some really sophisticated drone technology out there for surveying. There's a whole background of steps that goes into building a biodynamic farm beyond just the simple fact of using biodynamic techniques, because biodynamic farming really just allows you to build the most successful and sustainable system out there, but it has to be based on solid facts. So a lot of our work is gathering the data and assessing the land, so we can use biodynamic techniques to actually build out the farm.
So Andrew, lead us through it. You have, my understanding at least, is you have a 3-stage plan. You have the primary planning, the secondary planning, and the tertiary planning.
Sure.
If someone was to come to you and say, I want to build out an organic regenerative farm, what are these 3 stages?
Well, first, you have to understand if there's a market for what you want to do, because we can jump up and down about, how much compost we put on the ground and how much, biodynamic herbal sprays that we use. But if we're not sustainable in not just the environmental part, but also in the economic part, then there really isn't, you're really just not sustainable. You're not. So in the first stage, we establish if there is a market for the product or for the goals of the client or the customer that wants to build a biodynamic farm. Then once we establish if there's a market aligned with their goals, then we can go into assessing the property, which is assessing the soil and water component or resource of the farm. We also assess the climate resource of the farm, and that's just your local climate, which will determine your crop portfolio. And then we also just try and identify how we can use biodynamic techniques to sort of build back any of the limiting factors within the soil or the water resource, and that can be just soil remediation or, there's so many other components to that. But then the tertiary planning is just, we'll build the design of the farm, and that's everything based on our sound ecological facts that we've gathered for that individual farming system. And we use computer modeling and different technologies for building that design, and then we go ahead and develop it for the customer. But again, it has to be based on facts. We can't just be running around jumping up and down about how much compost we make. Do
you get those kind of clients, people who come in who perhaps have seen The Biggest Little Farm or just went to an organic vineyard and fancied the idea of starting something and have absolutely no idea, and you have to set them right, and then they leave your office and say, we're not going to do this?
Well, 9 or 10 times out of the time, we jump in and we start the development, because a lot of people, you know, I fall for that as well in different parts of my life, but it's just having this really idealistic idea of, you know, like the biggest little farm, you know, and how that ecosystem is so, you know, well put together and established.
How realistic was that film? I don't mean it as a movie itself, but if people went to see it, and they come out saying, I want to do that, what would you tell them, having seen the film itself?
Well, I mean, of course they can do that. It's just, it depends on your capital investment, you know, and that
Can you talk a little bit about capital investment, Andrew? I'm not sure how familiar you are with with some of the people who have been on the show. They're from very different worlds, backgrounds, but they all needed money to start their regenerative farm. Is there a minimum you need if you're practically wanting to set up a regenerative farm?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a cookie cutter minimum to what you would need to start a farm. It depends on your scale, but if it's on a commercial scale, then, and you want to set up a biodynamic farm,
like a Joel Salatin, for example.
I mean, Joel Salatin's been doing that, been working that land for 40 years, you know. I mean, some of our customers, you know, they don't want to be, you know, they want to do a very sound farm development, but they don't want to wait 40 years for the sort of fruition in their work, you know. What I would say in your capital investment is, if you want to get into building a biodynamic farm that's extremely well established, built on a solid foundation, and is at an economic scale, then you can, and this is not taking into account purchasing the land, you can be looking at $500,000, you know. I mean, that will pay you back over time, you know, through products and whatever the crop portfolio that we build for the farm. But it's not a cheap business. It's not. And if you want to get into building a biodynamic farm that is truly representative of your goals or your farming system that you envision, then it takes capital, and it does. I mean, that you can't get around that fact. That's why we really push at the beginning is, okay, what's our market? You know, how are we going to make this pay?
So let's get beyond, Andrew, the primary planning. Let's say that you establish the foundations. Let's get on to the secondary planning. Let's talk a little bit about what it should look like. The site selection, understanding your soil characteristics. For many of us, including myself, indeed, you know, soil is soil, but of course you're an expert, and one person's soil is something else for someone else. How critical is the choice of soil in terms of regenerative farming?
Well, it's absolutely critical. I mean, that's the anchor of our business, you know. I mean, that's foundational to what. Well, we have a soil resource, and we have a water resource, and we have a climate resource. We have to understand all three of those pillars of the foundation of the biodynamic farm before we can even go into building a farm design. So on your slide that you have here, where you had, there was an EM scan. So we use this guy. So we use a electromagnetic scanner of the soil that will penetrate down to about 2 meters. And you can see in this graph, in this image, that the red areas are the real wet, sticky areas, you know, with a heavier soil, and the greener areas and the lighter green are more of a free draining, lighter, sandier soil, you know. So just on that simple scanner that will run over this farm, as an example, we can clearly see where perennial plants will do well in the freer draining soils, and the annual vegetable ground will probably do better in the heavier ground. So before we even get into the biodynamic practices, we need to really understand the soils, and that's absolutely foundational. You can't, and I mean, our main goal in every farm design that we do on these different continents that we work on is to make the most successful farm in all manners of the farm as possible, and that's economic and environmental through regenerative farming. You know, that.
So soil, of course, is the central, both the philosophy and the concrete thing in the regenerative
Sure.
space and in this show. How much of a crisis broadly does the agricultural world face in terms of the destruction of the soil? Many of the guests on the show so far have suggested that we're on the verge of a catastrophe. Do you buy that, Andrew, in terms of the crisis of the soil?
Well, on a global scale, we are in we're in the last few minutes of the fourth quarter, you know, of trying to turn this ship around. And that's not me just trying to, like, you know, push regenerative farming, but it's just a simple fact that if we keep on this farming model on a global scale, we do not have a very positive future. That being said, on a local scale, where small local biodynamic farms, like Biggest Little Farm as an example, there are a lot of positive movement in the regenerative farming. Is the trick in the future is going to be, how do we take these small local farming systems, or biodynamic, organic, regenerative, and really scale it up to where we can actually make a true difference on a global scale. And that's the challenge in the next, you know, century.
Andrew, how intimately is the fate of the soil bound up with the fate of climate? Is the crisis of the soil essentially a crisis of climate, or can these two crises be separated?
You can't separate them, no. I mean, they're intertwined. I would say that, you know, when we talk of analogy in a biodynamic farm, you know, the health of the plant, regardless of what plant it is a direct reflection of the health of your soil. It's a complete mirror image of the health. If you have a poor looking plant, you have poor soil. So I would say that the state of our soils at the moment is a direct reflection of how we are treating our climate. You know, it's just using the tools that it has in its toolbox to show us that, hey guys, your approach in managing us is completely self-centered and backwards. So can we, and that's like getting a little bit, you know, but I would say, again, just repeat that the health of the soil on a global scale is a direct reflection of how we're looking after this planet.
And it's a strange mix, because soil is so local and climate is so global. I was struck in our interview with Dalmas Tiampati, the pastoral farmer in southern Kenya, and he spoke about the way in which global warming had essentially destroyed his soil. And of course, the reason why the cows were dying in southern Kenya had nothing to do with southern Kenya. It had to do with massive industrial pollution in Europe and North America and Asia. How do you combine these two things when your business is controlling the soil, but you can't control the climate? How do you juggle those two things?
Well, I would say that one of the ways that we can assist in a farm being successful in the long run is building resiliency within that farming system. And the resilience, the more resilient your soil is to climatic changes, and that can be, you know, building and maintaining organic matter within the soil at 5%. It can make sure that we have a good well-balanced texture within the soil. We can keep the soil covered with cover crops or with mulch. All we're doing there is we're not just focusing on remediating soil issues. We're actually just trying to make it more resilient for climate change. Because that climate is, even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow and we go back to hunter-gatherers, which is obviously not going to happen, but even if we do that on Wednesday, the climate is still going to change. Whether the cows are out of the barn or the horses are out, and that's going back to my dairy roots there, but the horses are out of the barn. That we can't change. But what we can do with regenerative and biodynamic organic farming is build resiliency within that system.
So what you're really saying then is that the local can impact the global, just as the global obviously impacts the local.
Sure, that's scale. That's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to not again, the farming model in the regenerative side is pretty, well established in local and regional areas around the world and around the States, as an example. But if we really want to make a global difference, we need to put that at scale. I mean, can't get around that.
Andrew, a couple of shows ago, we had the Swiss animal rights activist lawyer Antoine Goetschel on the show. And I'm curious, when it comes to the integration of animals onto the farm, where you stand, if indeed you do stand at all, on the issue of animal rights and, of course, of slaughtering animals and of free grazing and all these other quite controversial issues.
I mean, I am a proud, non-vegan cow, beef eating, pork eating, regular farmer. But I see, just in the farms that we do and we work with, we use livestock as an integral part of our farming model. Just using that in animal integration, rebuilding soils, increasing organic matter, also increasing soil microbial life within the soil. And the main tool that we have is animal integration. So, but I'm all for, if people in their own ideology don't see that as respectful for the animal themselves, then they shouldn't do it.
But sure. How would you respond to someone like Goetschel who argues that animals should have rights? Should they have rights on farms?
Well, I think we should. I think the short answer is we should be working on how do we have, human rights in our own society, or equal human rights in our own society, before turning to whether livestock have a sentient right in a farming model. I think treating animals with respect is absolutely critical, whether it's in a biodynamic system or a conventional system. If the farmer does not have the animal's health and well-being as a forefront in their management, then they're either a terrible farmer or a soulless human being.
And perhaps both. I think if you're a terrible farmer, you're likely to be a soulless human being, and vice versa. Andrew, let's move on to the third, the tertiary planning and development. When it comes to the creation of a regenerative farm. Sure. Explain what that involves. I know one piece of it is farm layout and design. Is that the fun bit, the tertiary bit?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that's where we can be creative, because we know that we've done our homework, we've built our foundational knowledge of this farm system, and now we get to do the real fun part, like you just said, and build a really creative farm ecosystem that's based on solid agronomy and solid climate data that we know that the plants that we're going to plant in the ground are going to thrive. So that's when we turn to, doing drone surveys or computer modeling to build the farm system and how it works. And that can be everything from how the orchards are going to be laid out, how the animals are going to be integrated, where the pollinator habitats are going, where there's opportunities for native habitat restoration to, we can be creative as you want to be, that's the fun part.
So it's essentially the interior design once you've built the house.
Well, sure. Like you just mentioned, like building a farm is like building a house. You have to understand the soils so you can build a foundation. Then once you have your foundation, you can layer on other parts of that house or farming system. And eventually, over years, you end up with a fully sustainable system that's not just sustainable in environmental concerns, but also in economic. That.
Andrew, you're a serious businessman, but you're also a visionary. You care about this stuff. And I know you have some frustrations with some of the unwillingness of people to acknowledge the practicalities of organic regenerative farming. If you could flip a switch and wake everyone up to one or two particular realities, what would those be?
Well, get out and enjoy your garden, man. That's why we have green space, and that green space can be it can be a window box with a few vegetables on your backyard, or it can be one of our larger farms at 10,000 acres, But just to get out there and enjoy the outdoors.
Hands on the soil. Put your hands in the soil. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely. There's a reason why you call it horticultural therapy.
And is that the sort of philosophy, do you think, of regenerative farming? Horticultural therapy, is it that anthrocentric?
Oh, sure. If you can speak with any farmer on this planet and soon understand where the priorities are in, and the health benefits of interacting with nature. That's a proven point over the eons that if you're outside and you're working with the soils and you appreciate it, and you don't just simply want to maintain it, you want to improve it, then you're doing the Lord's work there. I guess some would say.
Well, Andrew, I think we at Regenerate want to do, to quote you, the Lord's work in terms of bringing people back to regenerative farming. So we're going to have some regenerative retreats. What do you, if you were consulting for us, maybe I'm going to get some free advice from you, or maybe you can charge me later. We'd love, of course, these things. What should they look like, a regenerative retreat? If you could bring businessmen and enthusiasts and people perhaps who know nothing about it out into the countryside to see a regenerative farm, what would the experience, a weekend or a few days, what would it look like?
Well, again, it has to go back to starting with a solid foundation, and that is showing them, what soil is, because you can read about, what soil is as much as you want, but you have to go out there and you have to see those elements of the soil, and there's the organic, the living, and the mineral. And once you understand how we mix or how we interpret those three elements or realms of soil and how they interact, then we can fully understand how we build the farm model from that solid foundation of the soil. So we always start with the soil, and that is understanding those three elements within the three realms of soil. And on a retreat, that's the place to start. And eventually, once you fully understand where soil is and what it can bring, then you can fully understand and observe how the living, whether it's an orchard or a cabbage or a lowly radish, it's a direct reflection of those three realms within the soil, and that's getting pretty foundational, But
finally, Andrew, what is it about the soil that perhaps brings out what it means to be human? I know you've got a 4 and a 6-year-old, and it always strikes me that the younger we are, the more we seem infatuated with the soil. Should it make us somehow religious? Is there something divine in the soil?
That's probably getting a little bit out of my wheelhouse with religion and spirituality. I haven't quite got there yet in my life, but I would certainly say that soil and the living realm within that soil is something that should be fully understood, or people should be perhaps not. The goal is not to fully understand it as like an agronomist or soil scientist, but to really appreciate it. And that's probably more of the correct word, where once people appreciate the health and the benefits that soil can bring to one's life in different forms, then the more grounded you would be in your appreciation of just, the natural world. And let's just stop screwing it up. I mean, let's just stop doing that. Let's work to improve it.